I would like to introduce Dana Anderson, who is an new assistant professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. And she's going to tell us about some of her work on modeling protoplanetary disks and learning about the carbon and oxygen abundances in disks. So thank you.
All right. So thank you all for having me today. I'm excited to talk to you about my research. And as Jenny said, this is my first year as an assistant professor in the physics department at the U.S. Naval Academy. It's one of the several military service academies in the U.S. The students there are called midshipmen. I've got some pictures of my students doing a physics lab here. They are earning their undergraduate degree while preparing for a career as an officer in the Navy or Marine Corps. I teach introductory physics there, and I just wanted to advertise that while I'm here in my visit, feel free to ask me any questions about what it's like to work at the Naval Academy. I'm happy to share about my experience. And if you are a student or postdoc or know a student or postdoc who's interested in undergraduate-only institutions, I'm happy to answer questions about what my teaching research balance is and things like that. So on to the science. So the main goal of my work is to connect protoplanetary disk conditions to potential planetary outcomes. So there's been thousands of exoplanets observed to date, and many of them exist in planetary systems that are very different from our own solar system. And so at the same time, during the earlier stages, during the protoplanetary disk phase, we also see a wide variety of diversity within protoplanetary disk structures. And so our goal is to understand how this diversity in the early planet forming stages leads to different planet formation and evolution pathways that can explain the range of different exoplanetary systems that have been observed. Through exoplanet observations, several trends have led to questions about how the planet formation process occurs, including why do higher mass stars host more giant planets and lower mass stars more low mass super-Earth planets? How do giant planets form at large distances from their host star where we don't expect there to be as much material available? How do giant planets, How do giant planets form around very low mass stars in a system where we think there's barely enough, if enough, material to form a single giant planet? Why do these even exist? How does that process occur? And closer to home, is our solar system a typical case of the outcome of the planet formation process or something more rare? So we want to be able to understand these types of questions, and we can do that by relating these exoplanet observations to observations that we can make of protoplanetary disks. So for exoplanets, there's a variety of different quantities that can be measured from observations, including the solid and atmospheric gas masses of planets, their current location, distance from their star, and the chemical composition. And in particular, for the giant planets, their atmospheric composition, including C to O ratio and metallicity, which here I'm considering to be the carbon to hydrogen and carbon to oxygen abundances in these atmospheres. And these are all quantities that we can relate to the mass distribution and chemical composition of protoplanetary disks to try to connect these observed planets back to their early formation conditions. And in particular, there's a few different properties of protoplanetary disks that we can observe that we can directly relate to potential planetary outcomes. One being the total mass, gas and dust of the disk. That's going to relate to the number of planets that you could form out of this disk and their sizes and core to gas ratios. In addition, the chemical composition, where the chemical composition of the gases are going to lead to the gas giant atmospheres, whereas the solids will lead to planetary cores, rocky terrestrial planets, and planetary debris like comets and asteroids in our own solar system. And finally, the lifetime of the disk, because as the gas disappears from the disk, that will cut off our time scale for gas giant planet formation. And also limit the potential amount of gas relative to solid material to form different types of planets. And now astrochemistry, really comes into this problem because we can probe the gas mass composition and lifetime through molecular line emission. So that's where my research lies, in trying to understand this molecular line emission and how we can relate it back to these protoplanetary disk properties that we care about and can relate back to planet formation. So in order to understand how we study this line emission, it's helpful to think about the basic physical and chemical structure of a protoplanetary disk. So here I have a vertical cross-section through the disk around its central star. And the basic components of the disk are that it's mostly made of gas, mostly hydrogen with a small amount of helium, with a small component, about 1% of the total gas mass at the start, of silicate and carbonaceous dust grains. The things that I mostly care about, the volatile species, are at a much lower abundance, around 10 to the 4 or less relative to hydrogen, and those are divided up between the gas and ice coatings around the solid grains, depending on where you are in the disk and the disk temperature. And we have different regions of the disk that we like to think about. We have the inner disk that's close to the star, the midplane where planet formation is occurring through the middle of the disk, and then these surface layers above the midplane, usually where we're observing and probing with our observations. And so these different regions of the disk are important to note because we have large gradients in the physical structure throughout the disk, in particular density and temperature, which are going to be very important for setting different regimes of different chemical reactions occurring in these distinct regions of the disk. So the density tends to be higher in closer to the star and further as you get further away, and higher in the midplane and further as you go up towards those surface layers. And the temperature also changes throughout the disk, being warmer in closer to the star and along this irradiated surface, and cooler in the shielded midplane and outer disk. Relevant to our chemistry, we also have stellar and interstellar radiation and cosmic rays that can provide a source of energy to fuel chemical reactions. And so having this variation in physical conditions throughout the disk leads to a very interesting chemistry within the disk, where we have different regions both in the vertical and radial directions of different chemical species carrying the elements that we care about. So in the surface layers, it's highly irradiated, so our molecules are broken down into atoms and ions, but as we go deeper, we can actually shield and maintain our molecular carriers. And as we get further away from the central star and the disk is getting cooler, we have different ices freezing out of the gas phase, sequestering these materials into the solid phase, and potentially being fuel for planet formation growing out of these solids. So we have these different chemical regions throughout the disk, and we can probe them by using multi-wavelength observations. So the infrared wavelengths probe the warmer inner regions of the disk, whereas submillimeter wavelengths, like with the ALMA radio telescope, probe the outer regions of the disk. And by combining these different observatories, we can get a whole picture of what the chemical composition of the disk looks like. Well, not quite a complete picture, because we have optically thick regions in the midplane that are difficult to probe with observations, but we can get some information about what's going on in these regions, because that's where planet formation is occurring. So we have the chemical composition of bodies in our solar system, or exoplanets, tracing what materials are available in the midplane. At the same time, we're trying to put together observations at these different wavelengths and information from planetary bodies, and to really complete the picture, we use chemical models to bring this all together. So this is a complicated diagram showing the different steps that go into our modeling process. We start with an assumed gas and dust structure and our stellar and interstellar environment parameters, followed by a radiative transfer step that then starts to produce our temperatures in the disk and irradiation fields, followed by chemical modeling that treats the gas temperature and the chemical composition in the disk, depending on some assumed initial chemical abundances and chemical reaction work. So we might have one or two of these steps before we end up at our final chemistry, and then we can simulate observations with another radiative transfer step to produce emission. Question?
What the importance of dust for these chemical reactions?
So some of the chemical reactions include dust or surface chemistry that's occurring on the dust. There are also some codes that include evolution of the dust with some small amount of chemistry, but that becomes more computationally heavy. So usually you have a code that focuses on one or the other more so. But the dust is definitely playing a role. But the codes we're focusing on here are usually the ones that are more chemistry heavy with a fixed dust structure. So we use this forward modeling in order to predict what the molecular emission will look like under different underlying physical and chemical conditions, so that then we can compare those with observations and back out the underlying conditions in the disks that we are observing. So now that I've talked a little bit about the methods that we use, back to our questions, our quantities that we wanted to observe. And in today's talk, I'm going to focus mostly on the gas mass and the gas composition. And so these are quantities that we can estimate using multimolecular observations. So by that, I mean that we use multiple different molecular tracers in order to get at these quantities. In particular, for the gas mass, we're interested in using a combination of N2H plus and CO. So we use the CO flux to get the CO mass of the disk, and then the ratio of N2H plus to CO is sensitive to the CO to H2 ratio. So using the scaling factor, we can then get our total H2 mass. We don't measure the H2 mass directly because H2 is unobservable at these cool disk conditions, so we need to use some indirect tracer to back out the total H2 mass. And to emphasize the importance of getting constraints on the CO to H2 ratio, there's been a variety of different observations that have suggested that as the disks evolve, the CO over H2 ratio decreases from the initially assumed interstellar ratio of 10 to the minus 4 up to 2 orders of magnitude. And in fact, in this study here, I have 7 disks from a young star-forming region, Lupus. The purple is showing the observed fluxes. The blue in the background is models for different disk masses in the different lines and different levels of CO depletion in the 3 different size squares. And what I wanted to point out here is that we have 3 disks where we detected N2H plus at a sufficiently high level that compared to the mass, so if we were only using the CO emission alone, if we compare that to the models that it is closest to, that gives us a disk mass of around 10 to the minus 4 to 10 to the minus 3 solar masses. But when we add in the second constraint of N2H plus, then we're looking at these points compared to these 2 lines, which is a whole order of magnitude or more higher, up to 10 to the minus 3 to 10 to the minus 2 solar masses. So at least for some subset of disks, we see that this carbon depletion is an important problem that we have to account for if we want to get an accurate measurement of the disk gas mass. So back to our key tracers. So we're using the N2H plus over CO flux ratio to get those constraints on the CO depletion factor and more accurate H2 masses. In addition, another popular tracer is C2H, which is sensitive to the C to O ratio, which is also an elemental ratio that we can measure in exoplanet atmospheres to allow for that comparison. And you can see here is just one example of a model showing the sensitivity of the N2H plus to CO flux ratio to the CO depletion, and the C2H to 13 CO flux ratio being sensitive to the C to O ratio input in the model. So great. We'll just measure these gas masses and chemical compositions of a typical protoplanetary disk, and then we can hand those values off to our favorite planet formation theorist, and they can explain all of planet formation, right? Our problem is solved? Well, not exactly. So we still have some unanswered questions, particularly what are typical gas masses and chemical compositions? How much do they vary across disk populations? Do they depend on some of the stellar and disk properties, like the stellar mass or disk size? Does that give you a different disk mass or composition on average? And do they depend on things like age or birth environment for the disk? In addition, we have this question that we might like to sweep under the rug a little bit of how well can we actually determine disk gas masses and compositions from our current observations. So we can produce numbers from our models, but how accurate are those numbers? Do all models agree on what those numbers should be? So focusing on the first question, or first two questions to start, we compiled a sample of protoplanetary disks that all had this set of molecular tracers observed, in particular interested in that N2H plus to CO ratio for the gas mass, and also H2O plus and HCN as additional tracers of the ionization and chemistry. We had so from our own observations and compiling out of the literature, we pulled together 20 disks that had this set of molecules observed with either the SMA or ALMA. We ended up with mostly younger disks in the Taurus and Lupus star-forming regions and one additional source. And then we had a few in this older disk category, older than 5 million years. We had a few from the upper SCO and then a few other additional sources. So when we compiled all of these fluxes together, we wanted to see if there were any trends in these fluxes with other star or disk parameters. And what we found was that we didn't see any trend for any of our molecular fluxes with the stellar mass or the stellar luminosity. Luminosity could be an indicator of the temperature of the disk, which would be potentially related to chemistry, but we found no trend there. But we did see some trends, a kind of weak trend with the dust mass and the outer dust radius. So that suggests that for all of our fluxes, we had more flux when we had a bigger disk, which makes sense, but didn't tell us very much about what's controlling the chemistry. In addition, we used our N2H plus over CO ratio to make a rough estimate of the disk gas mass. So here I'm plotting our estimated disk gas mass versus the age based on just the age of the star-forming region that it came from. So there's some caveats there. But just to show that even when we're comparing sort of the older group to the younger group on the left, we see a wide range of different disk gas masses for every star-forming region. So star-forming regions are shown in the different colors, and also the different age bins. So we're not seeing a clear trend. You would expect that we would lose disk mass over time, so the older disks might be less massive, but we do see a pretty wide range overall. And for comparison, this is the amount of mass in Jupiter, so that kind of tells you about potentially the planet formation potential of some of these disks. Also, we looked at the variations in the chemical composition by comparing the molecular fluxes. So each of these bars is showing a different flux. So we have the purple is N2H plus, the pink is C18O, the dark blue is HCN, and the light blue is HCO plus. So this is fraction relative to the total flux of these four that's made up by each individual one. The hashed ones are upper limits where we didn't have a detection of the molecule. And here again, I've divided up into the different star-forming regions and the younger disks on the left and older ones on the right. And overall, just looking at this plot, again, we're seeing, even with these small sample sizes, a wide variety of diversity. So if we look at this Lupus star-forming region highlighted in green here, we have these two disks which have a very high amount of CO relative to the other tracers. And then at the other extreme, we have this disk here, which has no detection of C18O, but a high amount of N2H plus, similar to the ratio that we see in some of the older disks. So we find a diversity of chemical compositions even within the same star-forming region, which we expect to have formed in a similar environment and be of a similar age. But the problem here is that we compiled this together from a variety of different surveys. We have different detection limits leading to some of these upper limits not being as meaningful for comparison against others, and we had different amounts of disks from each region, so it's hard to make those really statistical comparisons and pull out any trends. So what we really need is a large uniform survey of many molecules across a range of protoplanetary disks in different populations. And that brings us to the ALMA-DECO survey. So this is a large program, the Disk Exoplanet Connection DECO. It was a almost cycle 9 large program where we're looking at 20 protoplanetary disks in 4 different star-forming regions to give us a total of 80 sources. We're also looking at a wide variety of spectral lines. So we have CO, N2H+, to go after the gas masses, C2H for C to O ratios, but also a host of other molecular lines that we can use to look at sulfur chemistry, more carbon-bearing species, and some of our stepping stones to complex ices. And our goal here is primarily to measure disk masses and C to O ratios across this entire sample, and to be able to compare across a range of different stellar masses, disk sizes, and the 4 different star-forming region environments. And these are pictures of the DECO team at 2 of our recent in-person meetings. So a very large group working on this very large data set. And so our 80 sources are going to sample a 3D parameter space, so we'll be able to compare how gas mass and composition depend on both the environment across the 4 different star-forming regions, the stellar mass, as I'm showing on the x-axis here. We go through a range of M and K type stars, and the disk size. So the size of the circles here are showing whether the disks are in that extended, larger category or smaller, compact disks based on their previously measured dust radii. And so we can try to tease out whether the chemical composition or the mass depends more on where the disks formed or the individual star and disk properties like the stellar mass and the disk size. So status of this program, all of the data has been taken, all of the data has been imaged, so we are in the science phase. This is an example of the continuum emission images for a subset of the disks, and results are underway. A lot of science going on with this data set, and going to be exciting to see what comes out of it. Yeah, so this would be a ring with sort of an inner gap in the middle. So yeah, very cool. This one was, this survey was not focused so much on the spatial resolution. We kind of went for moderate to get a larger number of sources in chemistry, but we are still seeing some very cool structure within these disks. So yeah. So back to our unanswered questions, bringing up this one down here, how well can we determine disk gas masses and compositions from our current observations? So this is another effort under the DECO team, where this is our DECO modeling team effort, where we want to assess the systematic uncertainties due to using different astrochemistry disk modeling codes. And so what we've done is we've brought together a team of modeling experts who are familiar with 6 different astrochemical disk modeling codes. They were each developed independently for separate purposes at the time, but they've all been used to try to explain these types of ALMA observations in the past. And so our goal is to have some fixed set of input parameters, so we're able to create the same input disk model in each of the 6 codes with the same stellar and properties and dust and gas abundances or distributions. And then after we run each of the codes, we want to compare the output molecular abundances, molecular column densities, and fluxes, sort of simulated observations, to see if we start with the same model, what range of values do we end up with across the 6 different codes? How consistent do we agree on molecular emission for a given input disk mass or composition? So just to highlight on this figure that I'd shown earlier, so we're fixing these inputs in the code, and we're also fixing the last step of simulating the observations. We're using the same methodology for that for all the codes, but we're letting the middle step vary, each code using its own process, and there's a wide variety of different assumptions that the codes make for treatment of temperature and chemistry together, whether those are linked or treated separately, how they do the radiative transfer to get UV and X-ray radiation. Also the size of the chemical network, how many species are included, what chemical reactions are included. That's a really big factor that's different among the codes. And if there are any other simplifying assumptions, because each of these codes was developed for a different purpose, Some of them were more focused on getting the disk gas temperature, and the chemistry was sort of built upon later. Some of them were developed specifically with ALMA in mind, or specifically with earlier telescopes in mind. And so they all have been developed independently, making these different assumptions at different stages, and we want to test whether or not they're making the same predictions for the same input disk. So here are some preliminary results out of this comparison that we've been working on. So here is just proof that we were able to create the same disk model in each of the codes. So this was the input gas and dust density. So we have a small dust population that extends further into the surface layers of the disk, and a large dust population that's concentrated more towards the midplane to account for that larger dust settling. And as you can see, each of the columns is showing one of the 5 different codes where we're creating a physical disk structure, and we've been able to create the same structure in all of the codes, which is a good sanity check. So then this one is showing, after we've run the chemistry part of the code, what do they predict for the molecular number densities for CO, N2H+, and C2H, our main tracers that we're interested in observing in the DECO program. And so the columns, again, are each of the different codes. Here you'll notice there's a 6 code. This one is a separate chemical network run on the physical structure from code 1. But when we compare across, you can see for CO, we have roughly the same range of abundances, so sort of the maximum, minimum are around the same level, and the same overall structure of having sort of this diagonal shape decreasing in CO abundance as we go up, but there are differences when you start to look closer between the individual models. We have the same idea with N2H+. We sort of have these 2 abundant diagonal regions going at the surface of the disk and also the midplane of the disk. This is where CO is depleted. This is potentially where there's a difference between N2 and CO self-shielding, which leads to a overabundance of N2H+ in the surface. And we see that pattern agrees across all of the models, but again, there are also some differences when you look closer. Finally, we have C2H, which is mainly produced in the surface layers of the disk. It's sensitive to the UV structure. And again, we see that maximum value is the same and always present in the surface, but as we go in the midplane, we see more differences among the codes about how much C2H they predict to be there. So next step is converting those chemical outputs from each of the code into simulated observations and fluxes, so like what we would observe from the DECO program. And very preliminary results here, what we find out of these codes. So here was the trends that I showed you from earlier, that we anticipate that as the carbon to hydrogen, so the carbon abundance is decreasing in the disk, we expect an increase in the flux of N2H+ over CO. And we see each of the codes here is shown in a different color. And for that same range, we are seeing that they do all agree that we are going to see that increase, that same trend with the carbon abundance. When we go to the right-hand side of the plot, we have our C2H to CO flux ratio, tracking the C to O ratio in the disk. And we see, again, for the models that I have shown here, the same increasing trend between C2H and C to O. So this is encouraging, although we are seeing a range of different values in the fluxes for each of these points that at least are agreeing on these chemical trends, that the tracers that we picked should be working to trace the quantities that we care about. So more to come from this in the future. In addition, other things to come. There have been many follow-up programs underway based on the ALMA DECO program, one being to compare the inner disk chemistry to the outer disk. So different JWST programs, there's 2 now, the one looking at the Lupus and Taurus DECO sources, and just accepted the survey to look at the Rho O sources, so now 3 of our 4 DECO regions. Also follow up with KEC and IRTF to look at CO in the inner parts of the disk for our DECO sample. We also are looking at chemical evolution, which I'll talk about in my lunchtime talk, with a follow-up of the upper SCO star-forming region, which is our deco sources are all expected to be in the 1 to 3 million year age range in those 4 different star-forming regions, but upper SCO is expected to be older than 5 million years, so we can have a comparison of the younger disks and older disks to see if there's a difference in disk gas mass or composition. Also follow up on disk ionization, and also looking at a broader range of stellar masses moving into the more intermediate mass stars with the Almaty program, focusing on disks around Herbig stars, which are the environment where more giant planets are forming. So understanding how the chemistry of these disks compare to the lower mass stars from the deco sample. So that brings me to my summary. We're interested in constraining the gas masses and compositions of protoplanetary disks. In order to do that, we need these large uniform surveys like the ALMA DECO program, which is going to estimate these parameters across a population of protoplanetary disks and see how they depend on things like the individual star and disk properties and also the environment that they form in. And we need the modeling effort to understand our uncertainties in these estimated gas mass and compositions to figure out what we can truly derive from our observations. And then finally, our goal is to connect these protoplanetary conditions to different planet formation pathways to understand the exoplanet observations that have been made to date. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, yeah, do we have any questions for Dana?
So obviously these disks make planets, and the planets affect the disk by their gravitational torque. So they could potentially drive gas as they migrate inwards. We know that there are migration and processes, and we know also of some planets that end up in the star, right? And we know about hot Jupiters. So obviously a lot has happened in these disks as planets migrated. Can you see evidence for that? Or, I mean, some of the chemistry that you see may be lost inside the star eventually because everything was brought in and only the outskirts were not affected.
So that brings up a lot of different questions. One being, as Karin Oberg suggested in some of her earlier work, looking at the C to O ratios of exoplanets and comparing that to the C to O ratio in different regions of the disk to say, does it match up with the location it's at now, or is it more consistent with one further out, suggesting that it migrated? So that's definitely trying to connect the observed C to O ratios of exoplanets back to their formation conditions is a whole nother puzzle of trying to tease out, what are you actually observing in the exoplanet case? How does that relate to the bulk C to O ratio? And, what has happened, in between its initial formation and where it is today? There's a lot more processes. So yeah, I feel like we're just at that very first step of like, if we just take what we have right now and make that comparison, do we see vast agreement or big differences? And then trying to go into these more complex processes. We don't know yet. We still have to, we still have a lot of work to do just even to get to that. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Dana. On the differences that you're seeing between the various models, what do you find are driving the sharp differences in the trends? Recognizing the trends are the same, you're seeing quite distinct ratio differences in one of the plots. I wonder what the key assumptions are that are driving that.
So I will say that is work in progress. We have our whole team meets once every 2 weeks, and that's our main topic of like, what is, how does your code handle this? How does your code handle that? Could that be driving the difference? Some things that we do know, for the N2H plus fluxes, they handle some of the ionization processes differently. One of the codes does not include scattering of X-rays down to the midplane, so you have a very different distribution of X-rays, which affects your ionization for producing N2H plus. Another one for the C2H, the amount of surface chemistry can tie up a lot of carbon into more ices, which affects how much carbon you have in the gas phase for forming C2H. So those are sort of our big culprits right now. But yeah, that's definitely our goal. I don't know if we'll be able to tease out all the differences, but to try to explain just at least some of the more major ones that we can point back to a cause.
And then an extension. So what do we know about ground truth then?
So that's not the point of this project.
Okay,
That's a whole
yeah.
separate project. At this stage, we're really trying to tease out what are the differences on sort of the theory side. But yeah, eventually you would want to say like, okay, if we take the same disk and try to model it with all the codes, which one gets the closest to our answer? But yeah, that's a whole new can of worms, separate project. But yeah.
Perhaps a scary quick question on this slide. Are the absolute fluxes from each of the codes similar to each other or similar to the observations so far? Do you know?
What do you mean by?
Like instead of the flux ratios, like are the fluxes that we get out, do they make sense?
So there is kind of a bit of a range in the ones that we're getting, and I have not tried to compare with observations yet. So that's I've mostly been looking at our ratios and sanity checking this step. But yeah, we do see a bit of a range in the fluxes, and I am showing just one model here. So we have two different setups. We have a K-star model and an M-star model to look at the chemistry under these different stellar mass regimes. And this is the K-star model, which is behaving a little bit more similarly across the codes. The M-star is a little bit more different. So we do have a lot of things to tease out in that side of things.
Cool. I see another question.
Hi, great talk. I was wondering what portion of the total nitrogen abundance do we know makes up the N2H plus?
Very little. So the vast majority of our nitrogen is going to be in atomic or molecular nitrogen. Which we're not able to probe either of those. So why we're using N2H plus and HCN are our main two ways of getting at nitrogen.
To follow up on Lisa's question, how degenerate is the nitrogen abundance with the cosmic ray ionization rate and going between those, because that'll set the N2H plus?
So I'll admit we haven't played with the nitrogen abundance as much because we haven't had as many expectations of like where else the nitrogen would go. But the cosmic ray ionization or like ionization overall tends to be a pretty big driver in the N2H plus over C18O ratio. So we didn't explore different cosmic ray rates in this model comparison, but in some of my previous models, and also Leon Trapman has worked on the N2H plus to C18O ratio, and that seems to be the major point of uncertainty is not having constraints on the ionization rate in the disk.
If you fold in like the HCO plus, does that help?
It can, but HCO plus tends to be optically thick, so we almost need to go for the H13CO plus and DCO plus. So going after those fainter lines and how to do that sort of on broad scale is another question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm not a modeler, so this might be a naive question, but just like going back to your methods, I think you mentioned that you, yes, like this slide, like you use the same inputs and the same output. Like what does that mean exactly, and how does that sort of like help you tease out the differences between the models?
Yeah, so we did the same input. So you start with the same gas and dust structure in the disk, and then the same central star, and cosmic ray rate is the main key thing here. And then by this step, I mean that we let all of the codes do their own radiative transfer, and then the thermochemical modeling, however they handle that. But then this step, once they've produced like the chemical abundances that I'm showing in this plot, then I use the same process for each of the codes to convert this into the simulated observations. So because some of the codes have their own ray tracing or radiative transfer methods to do that, but we didn't want to test that as a difference. We wanted to keep our tests to these two steps, the radiative transfer and then the thermochemical modeling. So yeah, that was the thought process there. Mm-hmm.
If not, I think that was plenty. Let's thank Dana one more time. Thank you.
We'll do more at the lunch, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, more to come, and free food later.